From the fragmented world of our everyday lives, we gather together in search of wholeness. So began this morning's responsive reading by Unitarian minister Philip Hewitt. It's a theme I touch upon quite often in many of the opening words I offer at the beginning of services, and it's certainly something I've heard from many of you about why you come here on Sunday mornings. I've heard people talk about this place, this time together, in terms of recharging their spiritual batteries, helping them prepare for the week ahead, reconnecting them with friends, their values, themselves, helping them put the pieces of their lives back together. That's life in today's world, after all. Hewitt uses the word fragmented, and that's certainly appropriate. We're pulled in so many directions. We're pulled apart from one another, and the pieces of ourselves are pulled apart too. There are so many demands on our time, on our energy, on our attention, on who we are, that it's a tremendous gift just to have the opportunity to put the pieces back together once in a while. And we're not doing that just by ourselves, of course. It's the gathering together with one another in a place like this that lets us move from fragmentation to wholeness. One of my favorite quotes, which I have on my office door to remind myself of its truth as much as anybody else who might see it, is by Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. We are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. We are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. Gathered in the same room, breathing the same air, singing or listening to the same music, being aware of the person sitting next to us, it's a physical, tangible reminder of the ways in which we are all connected. Awakening from our illusion of separateness, we become aware of the wholeness that is, in Unitarian Universalist terms, the interdependent web of all existence. Of course, that's much easier said than done. And the fact that it's far from easy is the real reason why religion exists. Other stuff gloms onto religion, just like the barnacles and seaweed that grow on boats. But strip it all away, and what you'll find is something intended to help people recreate wholeness out of fragmentation. But what fragments us? Hewitt explains, by many cares and preoccupations, by diverse and selfish aims, are we separated from one another and divided within ourselves. Now, for all that the fragmentation of our lives is a problem, I don't think that there's any implication here that our many cares and preoccupations are inherently bad, nor that our diverse and selfish aims are a result of intentional malice. That's just the way that life is. Sure, everything in our society seems to be competing for our attention, and built into the evolutionary processes that created us is, without going into the nuances, a general preference for selfishness over altruism. But there will always be things we want to do, things we want to achieve. That's simply life as we find it. It's how we choose to behave in response that says a lot more about who we are. For instance, one place you can find that phrase, life as we find it, is in a quote by Austrian neurologist and creator of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. Of course, it's a translation from his German in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, where Freud wrote, "Life as we find it is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, and impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. There are perhaps 3 such measures," he writes: powerful deflections, which cause us to make light of our misery, substitutive satisfactions, which diminish it, and intoxicating substances, which make us insensible to it. Even allowing, as he does for activities such as gardening and learning amongst his deflections, or art and music amongst his substitutions, it's clear that Freud's outlook on life could hardly be described as sunny. As for religion, by the way, he couldn't immediately decide which of the three palliative measures it was, though whether deflection, substitution, or intoxicant, Freud maintained that religious beliefs are merely illusions that allow people to distance themselves from reality. Thankfully, there's another place where the phrase appears, and that's in the English translation of the French motto, Comme je trouve. It literally means, as I find. But in the case of the British College that's named in honour of the 19th century feminist and social reformer Josephine Butler, it may be more expansively translated as we take life as we find it and make of it what we can. Far from claiming that the only way to respond to the realities of life is to run away from them, this is a philosophy that embraces reality and seeks to make life better. As Hewitt continues, we know that no branch is utterly severed from the tree of life that sustains us all. This statement is for me one of the most poetic expressions of universalism. The tree of life is, of course, a vivid image. Its roots sunk deep into the fertile soil of the creative cosmos, its branches ever growing with countless twigs and leaves. And no two of them are exactly alike. For while some of them might seem similar in appearance and general composition, each leaf that grows forth does so under slightly different conditions. Of course, every metaphor breaks down at some point, and sooner or later someone will ask if the tree of life is deciduous, which is why perhaps Hewitt refers to branches rather than leaves. So think, if it helps, of the evolutionary tree instead, what's known as the phylogenetic tree of life, where the branches keep growing and dividing down through the ages. We are on that tree. We are related to everything else on the tree. As Alicia Carpenter said in the middle verse of our hymn, our notion of family ought to be a whole lot bigger than it is. And in that sense, even species that no longer exist still have their branches on the tree of life. There's a whole set of branches for dinosaurs, for instance, even if the only dinosaurs still around today are the small feathered ones that we call birds. Well, that may be more than Hewitt had in mind when he wrote that we cherish our oneness with those around us and the countless generations that have gone before us. And that's as good an expression as any I've heard of the Unitarian half of our religious heritage. The wholeness we seek, after all, is oneness not only in space, but also in time, since the tree of life that holds all of us in the present also includes every one of our ancestors going back into the past. We are all one, and we always have been. We are all in this together, in spite of how any one leaf growing forth from the tree might have convinced itself that it is somehow independent from the rest of the tree. So rather than denying our interdependence, rather than trying so futilely to escape the hard realities of life, rather than pretending that we don't get caught up in concerns and difficulties that would fragment us, I would much rather we take life as we find it and make of it what we can. What would it mean for our efforts to deal with real-life problems, like poverty and racism and prejudice and sexism and injustice, if we don't work from a place that acknowledges life for what it really is? Obviously, that's a rhetorical question, but that doesn't mean that responding to it is easy. It's much easier to turn to one of Freud's palliative measures. And yes, that includes religion when it is merely offered as deflection, substitution, or intoxicant, rather than a way to really make a difference. Now, that doesn't mean that we should only ever speak of bad news. As Hewitt puts it, we would hold fast to all of good we inherit, even as we would leave behind us the outworn and the false. There is, after all, plenty of bad news. We don't have to work hard to find it. From natural disasters like droughts and epidemics, flooding and earthquakes, to human-made disasters like terrorism and bigotry, mass shootings and war, bad news triggers our primal fear that it could happen to us. Bad news grabs our attention, and so it also sells advertising. Unfortunately, that means that the good news tends to get buried. Now, this doesn't mean that we should discount or deny the bad news, of course. Bad news does demand a response and calls to our common humanity to help alleviate suffering. But to be able to do that, or at least to be able to do it for very long, requires the encouragement and the hope that can only come from good news. Responding to bad news requires resilience, and that requires good news to keep us going. So in response to the widespread mood that 2015 was such a bad year, Australian political economist, science communicator, and self-described optimist Angus Hervey wrote an article a couple of weeks ago entitled 11 Reasons Why 2015 Was a Great Year for Humanity. His subtitle, We are living through the most astonishing period of human progress in history, and nobody is telling us about it. Making his case for this, Hervey applied the criterion articulated by US President Franklin Roosevelt, that the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. According to that test of our progress, then, Hervey develops his 11 reasons to be a whole lot more hopeful about humanity. We got a lot closer to global universal education. Extreme poverty dropped below 10%, the lowest rate ever. More people around the world got connected to the internet than ever before. Millions of people gained access to financing for the first time. AIDS deaths came down for the 15th year in a row. Malaria death rates are at an all-time low. Polio is about to be eradicated forever. Fewer people went hungry in 2015 than ever before. More people have access to clean water. Child mortality plunged for the 43rd year in a row. And number 11 in Hervey's article, we reached a tipping point in the fight against climate change. Actually, Hervey isn't the only one to have developed such a list of reasons to be hopeful. Co-founder of Yes magazine, Sarah Van Gelder, came up with her own list of 6 hopeful breakthroughs from 2015. Van Gelder began by noting that the world set ambitious goals for climate stabilization, but real leadership came from the grassroots. And then she moved on to more United States-centered items, from the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement changed hearts, minds, and policing practices, to more public discussions of economic inequality and exploitation, and the start of a turn away from the US being a prison state. And that brings us to the next line of Hewitt's reading. We would escape from bondage to the ideas of our own day and from the delusions of our own fancy. Many of you were here at the beginning of November when we handed out Principles and Sources bookmarks featuring our new UUFP logo. If you didn't get one of these that day, or if you need another one, just let me know. I preached that day on the 7 principles, particularly in terms of what might help in memorizing them. So I didn't say much about the 6 sources. I also didn't say anything about the fact that the Unitarian Universalist Association is directed by its own bylaws to review and recommend revisions to the principles and sources at least once every 15 years. We claim to be a living tradition, after all, a faith not carved in stone for all time, but able to adapt and update itself as human society develops. Such a review process last began about 10 years ago, when, as one demonstration of the fallibility that is our biggest reason to be very careful about carving anything into stone, it had actually been well over 30 years since the last review. Now, this time around, the congregational delegates to the 2009 General Assembly in Salt Lake City decided that they didn't want to change the language of the principles that had been developed back in the early 1980s. Much of the discussion in this case was about the appeal of the 6 sources. And while I'm sure that some of the people who put so much time and effort into the review process were disappointed, it's actually okay. Because what matters is that there was a discussion about what matters. For instance, amongst the many sources from which our living tradition draws, the 5th source is named as humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. I love that we allow ourselves to use such language. Bondage to the ideas of our own day, delusions of our own fancy, idolatries of the mind and spirit. And these are by no means intended, I want to stress, as ways to disparage people of other religions whose beliefs we don't like. Rather, they are warnings to us. Warnings that you use of any stripe are just as likely to cling to the outworn and the false as anyone else. For instance, I'm amazed at the number of places these days that want information to be faxed to them. And my answer is, sorry, but I don't live in the 1980s. But when it comes to many of the ways that churches organize themselves, the dominant assumption seems to be that we still live in the 1950s. Of course, in some regards, our society does seem to have regressed recently, so Hewitt's next line is still relevant. Let us labour in hope for the dawning of a new day without hatred, violence, and injustice. This line is, in fact, the whole reason for all of this. It's why we and other UUs from across the state will be going to Richmond on Wednesday, January 20th, to meet with our elected legislators and talk with them about the issues that matter to us: access to healthcare, economic fairness, voting rights, and racial justice. It's why we'll be at First Baptist this evening and early tomorrow morning for our first Port Winter Shelter Night this year. It's why wallowing in bad news is just as bad as running away from it. It's why we have to be honest about the world, honest about ourselves, in order to take life as we find it and then be able to make something good of it. Let's face it, when one grand jury decides that there will be no criminal charges for the death of Sandra Bland in jail after her pointlessly escalated arrest, and when another grand jury decides not to prosecute the police who shot and killed Tamir Rice within 2 seconds of arriving at the park where the 12-year-old was playing, then it's clear that things have to change. When white men privileged to be in the media spotlight can spread lies about women and people of colour, when they claim that freedom of religion doesn't extend to Muslims and that immigrants and refugees are rapists and terrorists, and when a significant chunk of the voting population apparently agrees with them, then it's abundantly clear that things have to change. And the good news is that things are changing. Now that we're into the new year, California's ban on using grand juries in cases where people are shot by police has gone into effect. And with the state's economy being the 7th largest in the world, where California leads, other states are bound to follow. And then there is this story out of the Deep South. It was Christmas Eve in Augusta, Georgia, and the Muhammad family was having dinner at Olive Garden. Nobody there knew their surname, Muhammad, but everyone in the restaurant knew they were Muslim, with the women in the group of 7 adults and 5 children all wearing headscarves. When they were done with their meal, they asked for the check, But what the waitress brought them was a receipt on which the following had been written: "Paid. Merry Christmas, beautiful family." Posting about it on Facebook, Eslam Mohammed, who is a graduate research assistant at Augusta University, noted the great contrast between this wonderful act of generosity and kindness shown to his family with all the bad things happening to Muslims, with a wave of attacks at mosques in the last couple of months, and 2015 being, in fact, the deadliest year on record for American Muslims. But people all over the world are so hungry for such good news of generosity and kindness, that his post went viral, and it has since been reposted more than 28,000 times. So as Hewitt continues, let us nurture the growth in our own lives of the love that has shone in the lives of the greatest of women and men, the rays of whose lamps still illumine our way. Connected to the tree of life that gave us birth, we are the inheritors of a legacy of love. We know we are connected to one another and to our past, and we know that we shall either all rise together or we shall all fall together. Love calls us to rise, to unflinchingly take life as we find it, with all that is bad and all that is good. This is far from easy. As Alicia Carpenter wrote in our middle hymn, it's hard to grasp the cosmic span of time in which we find ourselves, but it's even harder to come to terms with the fact that a human life, when truly seen, is briefer than a kiss. But we don't have to do it alone. Just look around and you'll see plenty of people here who are in this struggle with you, shining forth their love, labouring in hope for a better world, holding fast to the good, gathered here in our shared search for wholeness. In this spirit we gather, in this spirit we pray. So may it be.